Welcome everyone, this is History 354, Modern China, and today's lecture covers the Civil War and the retreat of the Kuomintang to exile in Taiwan. By now, you have read a pretty detailed breakdown from Jonathan Spence of the Civil War, so I just want to highlight a few key analytical points that help to explain why, despite many comparative advantages at the outset of the war, the nationalists fall, and the Chinese Communist Party successfully launches a revolution. The question I want you to focus through this week's discussion forum is, which advantage enjoyed by the Chinese Communist Party in the Civil War actually proved the decisive factor? Was it the location of their base of power in North China, superior organizational skills and their appeal to the masses, the strategy of controlling the countryside and weakening the Kuomintang through guerrilla warfare, the ability to siphon off materials from the Soviet Union and Manchuria for a while, and then later steal what the American military was giving the nationalists, etc. Okay? We'll talk more about that in the forum. By 1945, there was nothing in the record of the Kuomintang in the battlefield or as a government to indicate that it would easily win a civil war against the growing Communist Party, but it did enjoy considerable advantages, at least on paper. The size of its armed forces was roughly twice the size of its enemy. It had already won the opening offensive, which we might call the reoccupation of the rest of China as Japan withdrew. Aided by the U.S. military, the Kuomintang swiftly moved from Chongqing and Sichuan province to take control over the vast majority of China's major cities, and laid claim to control over much of its territory. Its drive to pursue the Chinese Communist Party and their base of power in North China was also helped by the Marines, who were located in Beijing and Tianjin, mostly to forestall any kind of Soviet encroachment in this area. And in the coming conflict, Chiang Kai-shek, or Zhong Jieshi, could count on U.S. military and equipment and supplies, giving him an air force and control on the seas that should have been formidable weapons against his enemy. But he rejected their advice and planning, considering them as outsiders. I'm talking here about his American advisors, who were ill-suited to understanding the history of China and how power had to be won in the north. Ironically, his plan to vanquish the communists closely copied Japan's plans in the Second World War. The Kuomintang prioritized taking control of provincial capitals and holding them at all costs because they were symbols of power that he hoped would awe the masses in the countryside into submission. In the early years of the war, then, the Kuomintang used its superior firepower and transport and control of cities to chase the Chinese Communist Party along the rail lines of the Northeast and to try and push them ever further out into Manchuria and then beyond. The plan frustrated Chiang's U.S. advisors. They told him he was being overextended and taking too much control and ownership over the campaigns and not trusting local leadership and divisions on the ground to engage in tactical offensives. They wanted him to consolidate his hold on North and Central China, where the Chinese Communist Party... Sorry if you could hear that, that's my son yelling something in the background about his toys just as he heads off to bedtime. To continue, the American advisors thought that the Kuomintang should focus on consolidating their base of power in North and Central China, where, despite holding all the cities, the Chinese communists remained very strong in the countryside. Some had even counseled that the Kuomintang should think about going as far back as its base of power along the lower Yangtze region and fighting from there, and prolonging the civil war, but ultimately strengthening the Kuomintang's hold over its base of power and shoring up its government. In the end, the Kuomintang's offensive in the north and northeast by 1947 and 1948 was on the verge of being a complete military disaster because it was based on anachronistic assumptions about how to control China, meaning its ideas about how to win China were largely outdated and irrelevant to the war that was actually being fought. The Kuomintang forces were overextended, encircled in cities, failing into a trap set by the CCP's, the Chinese Communist Party's classic use of guerrilla warfare. Not fighting in any conventional engagements, but instead retreating and only attacking and raiding supply lines and cutting rail lines when they had an advantage in terms of numbers. Cities mattered much less than political mobilization and the countryside. Within the territories controlled by the Kuomintang, the methods of rule we discussed last week that we labeled its adoption of survivalist rule in Chongqing were transported to the rest of China. To finance the war, the regime relied heavily on taxation and requisition, with officials taking control of factories, firms, commodities, goods, and banks. GMD officials were slow to put things back into production, so unemployment rose and consumer goods and needs ran short, and there were lots of shortages within its base of power. Starvation and profiteering by locals, hoarding officials, was rife, especially in the countryside. Simultaneously, the Kuomintang was on the hunt for political enemies. It dealt harshly with Chinese who had collaborated in these areas with the Japanese, which often included industrialists and the middle class. And the government tried to suppress the public peace movement, seeing this as some kind of grand communist conspiracy to undermine the war. Which is ironic given the fact that it did not treat labor in areas like Shanghai with the same suspicions, and thus the Chinese Communist Party in that area was able to infiltrate factories and firms and spur a lot of demonstrations that actually forced the Kuomintang to placate their interests, and in the long run kind of strengthening the Chinese Communist resurgent within cities in the south. Coupled with its offensive in the northeast, this led most Chinese to see the Kuomintang as the instigator of the Civil War, and to fault it for doing so. And see it as a regime that was so dependent on militarism for power, it was no better at this point, by 1947 and 1948, than the warlords had been. Traditionalists started ascribing to the Kuomintang the role of the famed bad last ruler of a dynasty. So this is kind of the idea of a return to cyclical history. The Kuomintang was desperate, despotic, and incapable of change, and ultimately doomed to fail, according to this kind of traditionalist view of history. Regardless of politics, the inflation crisis simply made life in the Kuomintang-controlled areas untenable. The currency reform of 1948 was its last chance to use the new Fabi, or gold yuan, to try and fix problems related to prices, wages, and government reserves of species all at once. And it failed, miserably. Prices rose by 85,000 times in a matter of 6 months, and the money classes felt defrauded and fooled again. The last point I want to make here, though, is that not all the problems behind the Kuomintang's lines of control were its own doing. While the peace movement was certainly not a communist conspiracy, the Kuomintang treated as such and acted harshly towards liberals, industrialists, and the middle class. These elements, though, didn't go over in large numbers to the cause of the Chinese Communist Party. It was more that they lost hope that the Kuomintang could ever be more than a despotic regime dependent on outside power, in this case, the United States, for survival. And unable to fully control the press in the cities, the Kuomintang's crimes against its own citizens instead just continued to feed an ever-growing record of their abuse of power and their ill-equipped nature to rule over mainland China. On the other side of the Civil War, the Chinese Communist Party built up its wartime achievements to launch a revolution with incredible energy across the north and northeastern countryside through its use of cadres. Local activists and CCP, Chinese Communist Party agents, followed a potent recipe for mobilization. First, they would aid peasants with their manpower, having soldiers help them work on fields, harvest, repair ditches, and irrigation networks. Then they would use education and resources to improve local production. Once they'd won the trust of many farmers and peasants, they began the political campaigns of village indoctrination, thought reform of activists, and recruiting troops for a patriotic war against a puppet regime, the Kuomintang and its propaganda, controlled by the interests of a foreign power, the United States. A powerful incentive for rural Chinese was the promise of land reform, with the Chinese Communist Party reducing their rents or seizing the holdings of only the wealthiest or absentee landlords. This kept the category of landlords, those that were exploitive and enemies of the people in the rhetoric and theory of the Chinese Communist Party, very small. And they were able to create a compelling scapegoat for the community's problems that would rally them all to collective action and working together. The populations of the Northeast were, especially in Manchuria, primed for a social revolution even before the Chinese Communist Party arrived. Years of abuse by the Japanese frustrated activists, farmers, intellectuals who wanted a radical change to the life and conditions in their communities that had made exploitation possible. While the Chinese communists worked to bring existing local leadership into their ranks in this place, the Kuomintang distrusted them and tried to keep its distance from locals and elites. Instead, they acted like outsiders, bringing in Southerners, Southern Chinese that is, to install a new regime in the north when they controlled the major cities. And the one man that could have been used to solidify their hold in the northeast, Zhong Zuolin, was the warlord and general who had forced Chiang Kai-shek into the United Front during the Second World War by kidnapping him, and thus he was still under house arrest. Instead, the Kuomintang was trained not to socialize with the local citizens. They kept their distance. They refused to fight at night because they thought it favored the Chinese Communist Party, and thus they moved very, very slowly. All things that gave the Chinese Communists huge advantage in winning the battles for the hearts, minds, and territory of North China. When the Chinese Communist Party was strong enough to launch a series of counterattacks in mid-1947, mobilization in the countryside allowed them to dominate large swaths from areas in Shandong and project power into critical areas such as along the Beijing-Hankou Railway and the northern rim of the Yangtze River Valley. Cut off from each other, Kuomintang forces in this region and major cities, including Beijing, started to surrender in early 1949, and many troops and stockpiles of U.S. materials now enhanced the Chinese Communist Party's People's Liberation Army. It enhanced its military. At the climatic battle of the Huai region north of Nanjing, it was again the CCP's, the Chinese Communist Party's mastery of the countryside, and its ability to encourage rural masses that would decimate the Kuomintang's last stand. With Chiang Kai-shek's armored vehicle corps, its tanks, its battalions all trapped and destroyed by traps dug out to encircle and destroy them by millions of peasants at the prodding of Chinese Communist Party leaders like Deng Xiaoping. Essentially, they were able to wreck the capacity of the Kuomintang for mobile warfare and the use of modern tanks by just digging millions and millions of holes and ditches and traps that would entangle them and stall them. From there, Chiang Kai-shek and his Kuomintang loyalists adopted the method of resistance patterned by Koxinga, the Ming loyalist, in retreating to the islands of Taiwan. Initially, the likelihood of the Kuomintang surviving there looked very bleak, given its track record on the mainland. The island was rife with conflict, given the influx of some 2 million new arrivals, who took power and seized control of the island's resources, institutions, and infrastructure immediately. It also looked for a time as if the U.S. would abandon Taiwan and the Kuomintang. American advisors were disgusted with the outcome of the Civil War, and within the State Department and Truman administration, there was an exploration of the question as to whether or not cordial relations could be established with Mao. No guarantee was given that the U.S. would protect Taiwan when Mao moved to take it. But the onset of the Korean War and a rabid anti-China coalition of congressmen and former American missionaries combined to make the Kuomintang a staunch Cold War ally of the U.S. By 1954, the Kuomintang had a security pact with the U.S. and saw investment and trade with Japan help fuel its growing economy. It was also in possession of China's seat on the United Nations Security Council. Chiang and his government never renounced their claim to being the one true representative of all Chinese people on the mainland, islands, and everywhere else. And both he and Mao agreed that there was only one China and Taiwan was an integral part of that country. In some diplomacy, Chiang and the Kuomintang's strong suit since the 1930s would continue to be a facet of modern statehood that the regime excelled at, just as it had on the mainland. And I'm actually going to stop my video here. I have about 5 to 10 more minutes, then I'm going to upload in a second video to finish this lecture. Thank you.